Lecture number 2, Probability Distribution 1. Today we have to define probability, different definition of probability, different definition of probability. Number 1, classical definition of probability. Number 2, classical definition of probability or priori definition of probability. Probability. Number 2, empirical definition of probability or posterior definition of probability. Relative frequency, or posterior definition of probability. Number 3, axiomatic definition of probability. The axiomatic definition of probability. Now we explain all these three types gradually. Number 1, classical definition of probability. Probability. If we have a random experiment which have n mutually exclusive, and equally likely outcomes, let out of these n outcomes we have m outcomes favorable to event A, then according to this definition, probability of A will be equal to m by n. This is the classical definition of probability. We have assigned two names to this probability definition, that is classical definition of probability or priori definition of probability. Classical definition of probability or priori definition of probability. Shortcomings. Shortcomings or limitation in this definition. Number one, this definition involving two things. Number one, number A, mutually exclusive outcomes of sample space. And number two, B, outcomes of the experiment are equally likely. If these two conditions are not satisfied, so we cannot apply this definition of probability. These are the two main drawbacks. If the events of the sample space are not mutually exclusive, then you cannot apply this definition. And secondly, if the outcome of the experiment are not equally likely, then again you cannot. So these are the two shortcomings of this definition. Axiomatic definition of probability. यहाँ हम probability of an event को हम axiom पे define करते हैं. Suppose let A be an event, then the probability of A will satisfy the following axioms. Number one, probability of A must lies between 0 and 1. Number two, for A and B to be mutually exclusive, probability of A union B will be equal to probability of A plus probability of B. And number third, probability of sample space will be equal to 1, where rho is a sample space. Rho क्या है? ये sample space है. And IV number, probability of A must be less than or equal to 1. So if this probability of a probability of an event satisfy these four axioms, we say that It is the axiomatic definition of probability. Relative frequency, relative frequency or posterior definition of probability. Relative frequency means relative frequency means probability of an event. Relative frequency means probability of an events. Actually, the relative frequency of an event is the probability of that event. For example, a coin is tossed 10 times. For example, a coin is tossed 10 times and number of heads is equal to 3 and number of tails equal to 7. So this form a relative frequency distribution. First we form a frequency distribution from this and then the relative frequency. So you will see that this relative frequency is actually the probability of the events. So we have two groups, two mutually exclusive groups. For tossing a coin, one group is head and other is tail. Frequency here represents the number of heads and the number of tails. So the number of head will be equal to 3 and the number of tail will be equal to 7 and total frequency will be equal to 10, which is equal to n. Now relative frequency, we know the definition of relative frequency, frequency divided by total frequency. What is relative frequency? Frequency divided by total frequency. Here summation f equal to n. So this is 3 by 10 which is equal to 0.3 and this is 7 by 10 which is equal to 0.7. So and the total of 0.3 and 0.7 is 1.0. So actually it is the total probability. So relative frequency here is the shows the probability of an event. So the first 0.3 shows the probability of head and the second one 0.7 shows the probability of tail. So this is actually relative frequency means probabilities. This is probabilities. So relative frequency definition में हम क्या करते हैं, relative frequency से हम probabilities मालूम करते हैं. For example, we toss this coin again n equal to, suppose we toss this coin now the same coin is tossed, suppose n equal to 100 times and suppose number of head is equal to 60 and number of tails which is t equal to 40. So in this case the relative frequency will be equal to groups, that is head, tail or total. Frequency, in this case number of head is 60, number of tail is 40. So relative frequency RE RF will be equal to 60 by 100 and 40 by 100. So this is equal to 0.6 and this is equal to 0.4. So the total probability here again is 1.0. So this column just shows, this relative frequency column shows the probability. Again, now we toss this coin n equal to 1000. So here, suppose heads, number of heads, number of H are heads. This is equal to, suppose here is 495 and number of tails is equal to 505. So here again the frequency distribution is groups head tail frequency. This is 595 and 505 and relative frequency here is 595 by 1000, 0.595 and 505 by 1000, 0.505. So again this is equal to 1.0 total probability. So this relative frequency column shows the total probability. Now look into these figures. First we just toss the coin only 10 times. So probability of 0.3. Generally from the relative frequency, from this experiment number 1, experiment number 2, experiment number 3, we find the probability of an event that is head and tail. Generally we say that if we toss a coin, then the probability of head will be equal to 1 over 2 or the probability of tail will be equal to 1 over 2. So in first experiment the probability of head is 0.3 and the second experiment the probability and the second experiment, the probability of head is 0.6 and in the third experiment the probability of head is 0.595. So for n equal to 10 it is 0.3, for n equal to 100 it's increased to 0.6 and for n equal to 1000 it decreased to 0.595. So what does it mean? This probability of head converges, into 0.2, that is probability of head converges into 1 over 2, that is 0.5 for n tends to infinity. Means when n increases, when the number of trials increases, this n approaches to 0.5 and similarly probability of tail also approaches to 0.5. So this is a relative frequency or posterior definition of probability. Posterior in the sense that after repeating the experiment, our probability of head converges to 0.5 and probability of t is converges to 0.5. That's why we say that probability of head is 1 over 2, which is equal to probability of tail. So first we performing the experiment and then we define this probability. So this is what we call posterior definition of probability. Posterior means बाद में आप probabilities को define करते हैं, पहले आप experiment करते हैं. So we are the first experiment n is smaller, that is 10. In the second it is 100 and third it is 1000 and the probability of head converges to 0.5. So this type of definition is called relative frequency definition of probability.